"She's too small for combat," one of the Navy SEALs muttered as Lieutenant Emily Carter stepped onto the blistering concrete of Al Assad Air Base, and the laughter that followed rolled through the hangar louder than the helicopter blades fading behind her. The desert wind pushed loose sand across the runway in thin golden streaks while mechanics shouted over the noise of refueling trucks and spinning rotors. Emily adjusted the strap of her medical pack without looking at the men who were staring at her. At 5'4" and barely 120 pounds in full gear, she looked out of place beside the broad-shouldered operators unloading rifles and duffel bags from the Black Hawk. One of them nudged another with a grin. "Command really sent us a rescue attachment that looks like she belongs in a college classroom." More laughter followed. Emily kept walking. Her boots crunched softly against the sand-covered tarmac as if she hadn't heard a single word. Chief Logan Reeves watched her from near the open hangar doors with narrowed eyes. He had spent 15 years in special operations and trusted experience over paperwork. What he saw in front of him did not match the file command had sent earlier that morning. The report described Lieutenant Emily Carter as one of the best combat rescue specialists in the region, cross-trained in field medicine, navigation, extraction coordination, and survival operations. But standing beneath the harsh Iraqi sun, with a tan backpack hanging from her shoulder and pale blonde hair tied into a tight regulation bun, she looked too calm and too small to belong with his team. "You Lieutenant Carter?" Logan asked as she approached. Emily stopped in front of him and nodded once. "Yes, Chief." Logan studied her for a moment. No nervousness. No attempt to impress anyone. Just a steady pair of gray eyes that barely moved even with the chaos around them. "You attached to my unit for the convoy recovery mission?" "That's correct." One of the younger SEALs behind Logan laughed under his breath. "Recovery mission," he said. "Ma'am's gonna recover us by handing out band-aids." A few operators smirked while another shook his head. "This storm season's bad enough already. Now command sends us a rescue Barbie." Emily finally glanced toward the voices. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that somehow made the laughter fade faster than expected. Logan noticed it immediately. Most people reacted when challenged by a SEAL team. They got defensive, nervous, or eager to prove themselves. Emily Carter simply absorbed the comments like they were nothing more than background noise. "You got combat experience, Lieutenant?" Logan asked. Emily looked back at him. "Enough." The answer irritated one of the operators standing nearby. Petty Officer Mason Cole folded his arms and scoffed. "That usually means no." Emily didn't respond. Instead, she crouched beside a stack of supply crates near the helicopter and opened her rescue pack. The operators kept talking while she checked equipment with smooth, efficient movements. Oxygen tubing. Thermal blankets. Trauma kits. Signal beacon. Satellite tracker. Every item inspected in seconds before being secured back into place with practiced precision. Mason watched her hands for a second before muttering quietly, "At least she knows how to organize gear." Another operator leaned closer. "Probably spent her whole deployment inside air-conditioned clinics." Logan remained silent, but something about Emily's movements bothered him. Not because they looked inexperienced. Because they looked automatic. Fast. Economical. Like muscle memory built under pressure. Emily secured the last buckle on her pack just as the warning siren echoed across the air base. Every conversation in the hangar stopped. Operators turned instantly toward the command tower while red emergency lights flashed above the runway. The loudspeaker crackled through static. "Immediate response team to briefing room 3. Repeat, immediate response team to briefing room 3. Logan cursed under his breath. "That's us." The SEAL team grabbed their gear and moved quickly across the hangar floor. Emily rose silently and followed behind them. One of the younger operators glanced back at her while jogging toward the briefing room. "Try not to slow us down, Lieutenant." She said nothing. Inside Briefing Room 3, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Giant digital maps glowed across the walls while officers crowded around a sand-covered tactical table. A convoy transporting communications equipment had disappeared nearly 60 miles west of the base during a developing sandstorm. Last contact came 17 minutes earlier. Visibility in the region had already dropped below 20 feet. Satellite coverage was failing. The convoy carried 6 personnel, including 2 intelligence officers. Weather conditions are deteriorating fast, the operations commander said grimly. This storm cell is moving faster than forecasted. If they're stranded out there after dark, odds of survival drop hard. Logan crossed his arms. Extraction route? Unclear. The commander tapped the map. We lost their beacon signal 2 minutes ago. The room went silent. Even the younger operators stopped joking. Everyone in Iraq understood what sandstorms could do. Vehicles vanished. Radios failed. Entire patrols disappeared under walls of dust thick enough to block out the sun. The commander looked directly at Logan. You leave in 10 minutes. Logan nodded once. Understood. Then the commander's eyes shifted toward Emily. Lieutenant Carter will guide survival and rescue operations if visibility collapses. A few operators exchanged skeptical looks again. Mason leaned slightly toward another SEAL and whispered, "We're dead." Emily heard him. She simply tightened the straps on her gloves and looked toward the giant tactical map where the storm spread across western Iraq like a living thing swallowing the desert whole. Outside the briefing room windows, the sky had already begun turning dark gold. And for the first time since arriving at the base, Emily Carter slowly lifted her eyes toward the horizon with an expression that made Logan Reeves feel something he couldn't explain. Not fear. Not nerves. Recognition. Like she had seen storms like this before. Like somewhere beneath the screaming wind and endless desert, something terrible was already waiting for them. The Black Hawk lifted off into the darkening Iraqi sky with a vibration that rattled through every metal plate beneath their boots. Sand scraped against the aircraft like dry rain while the rotors hammered the air overhead. Inside the cabin, red emergency lights painted the operators in deep shadows as they checked rifles, radios, and harnesses one final time. Nobody talked much at first. The closer they moved toward the storm front, the quieter the aircraft became. Lieutenant Emily Carter sat near the rear door with her rescue pack secured between her boots. She had not spoken since leaving the briefing room. Her gray eyes remained fixed on the small reinforced window beside her seat where the desert outside had slowly transformed into a swirling wall of orange dust. Chief Logan Reeves sat across from her, tightening the strap on his gloves while watching the storm build ahead. The pilot's voice suddenly crackled through the headset system. Storm front expanded another 12 miles. Visibility dropping fast. One of the younger operators shook his head. Perfect night for a rescue mission. Another laughed nervously. If we survive this, I am requesting a transfer to Hawaii. Mason Cole leaned back against the side of the aircraft and looked directly at Emily. You ever been through a real sandstorm before, Lieutenant? Emily nodded once. Yes. Mason smirked. Training exercise does not count. Emily did not answer immediately. She simply reached into one of her side pouches and pulled out a folded paper map even though the aircraft carried full digital navigation systems. Mason noticed and frowned. Seriously? You trust paper maps over satellite systems? Emily spread the map carefully across her knee while the helicopter shook beneath them. Satellites fail in storms like this. Mason rolled his eyes. This is why nobody likes rescue specialists. Too dramatic. A few operators chuckled quietly. Logan watched Emily instead. Her fingers moved across the map quickly, tracing roads, elevation markers, and dry riverbeds with calm precision. She glanced once toward the side window, watching the direction of the sand moving against the aircraft, then marked something small near the convoy's last known coordinates. Logan leaned slightly forward. "What are you checking?" "Wind drift," Emily answered. Storm shifted northeast faster than command predicted. Logan frowned. "You can tell that from here." "You can feel it." Mason gave a quiet laugh. "That is reassuring." The helicopter suddenly jolted sideways hard enough to slam several operators against their seats. Loose equipment rattled across the floor. The pilot's voice returned instantly, sharper now. "Strong crosswinds. Hold on back there." Through the small window beside Emily, the world outside had almost disappeared completely. The desert sky no longer looked natural. It looked alive. Thick layers of swirling sand climbed thousands of feet into the air, swallowing moonlight and horizon together until there was nothing left but moving darkness. One operator muttered softly, "Feels like flying into hell." Nobody argued with him. Logan adjusted his headset and looked toward the cockpit. "How long until target zone?" "Approximately 14 minutes if visibility holds." The pilot paused. "And that is a big if." Another violent gust struck the helicopter. Warning alarms flashed briefly inside the cockpit before fading again. Emily quietly folded the map and secured it back into her pack. Then she reached up and tightened the chin strap beneath her helmet. Logan noticed something strange again. No fear. No tension. Most operators became sharper or louder before entering dangerous situations. Emily became quieter. Like every movement was conserving energy for something ahead. Mason noticed it too and shook his head. "You know what I think?" Emily looked toward him calmly. "I think command sent you because they needed somebody to babysit casualties after we do the real work." A few operators smirked again. "Probably true," another added. "Soon as bullets start flying, she will stay behind cover with the med kits." Logan expected Emily to ignore them again. Instead she looked directly at Mason for the first time since boarding the aircraft. "If things go bad out there," she said quietly, "you will want me close." Her voice was calm. Almost soft. But something about the way she said it caused the cabin to fall silent for a second longer than expected. Mason forced a grin afterward. Confident. Emily looked back toward the storm outside. Prepared. Logan stared at her in silence. The helicopter continued deeper into the storm front while sand hammered harder against the aircraft's skin. Visibility outside dropped until even the blinking navigation lights on the tail became impossible to see through the dust clouds. The pilot cursed over the headset. "I have almost no visual reference now." The co-pilot responded immediately. Switching to instrument guidance. Static crackled through the communications system. Then the radio signal distorted for half a second before returning. Logan glanced toward the cockpit. "Tell me that was interference." Nobody answered immediately. Emily slowly turned her head toward the front of the aircraft. "The storm is carrying electrical activity now," she said. "Communications may collapse completely closer to the ground." Mason looked irritated. "You always this cheerful?" Emily ignored the comment. She reached down beside her boots and pulled a small emergency compass from her vest pocket. Logan raised an eyebrow. "You expecting total systems failure?" Emily studied the compass needle for a moment before answering. "I expect storms to behave like storms." Another operator shook his head. "Still cannot believe command attached a rescue lieutenant to a Tier 1 mission." Logan finally spoke up. "Enough." The cabin quieted instantly. Logan rarely raised his voice, which made it more effective when he did. He looked around at his men carefully. "You do not have to like the assignment. But you will respect it." Mason leaned back without responding. The silence returned again except for the roar of the rotors and the violent scraping of sand outside. Then suddenly the cockpit alarm blared sharp through the aircraft. The pilot's voice cut across the headset system immediately. Possible heat source ahead. Multiple vehicles. Logan grabbed the overhead rail and stood slightly. Convoy? Maybe. The pilot paused. Or maybe wreckage. The operators immediately shifted into mission mode. Helmets tightened. Weapons checked. Harnesses secured. The joking disappeared completely now. Emily remained seated, but Logan noticed her eyes narrow slightly toward the storm ahead like she was trying to recognize something hidden inside it. Then the aircraft dropped suddenly several feet in a violent pocket of air and one sentence came through the radio from the convoy before static swallowed the transmission hole. "Please, somebody help us." The Black Hawk descended through the storm with violent turbulence that shook every bolt in the aircraft. Sand blasted against the windshield so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel thrown by invisible hands. Warning lights flickered across the cockpit panels while the pilots fought to stabilize the helicopter against crosswinds powerful enough to push the aircraft sideways through the air. Inside the cabin, nobody spoke anymore. The joking from earlier had vanished completely beneath the growing tension pressing through the aircraft like weight. Chief Logan Reeves stood near the side door gripping an overhead strap while staring into the swirling darkness outside. There was no horizon anymore. No moonlight. No desert. Only thick orange dust moving in endless waves across the sky. "Target zone approximately 1 mile ahead," the pilot shouted through the headset. "That is the best estimate I can give." Mason Cole adjusted his helmet and looked toward Logan. "You think the convoy is still moving?" Logan shook his head slowly. "Not in this." The radio crackled again with bursts of static before cutting out completely. One operator cursed quietly under his breath. Another checked his own communications unit twice as if refusing to believe it had failed. Emily Carter sat perfectly still near the rear ramp with the emergency compass resting in her palm. She watched the needle carefully while counting seconds beneath her breath almost too quietly to hear. Logan glanced toward her. "What are you doing?" "Tracking drift speed." Logan frowned. "You can calculate that in here." Emily nodded once. "Storms rotate differently when they hit open valleys. If the convoy stopped inside one, the wind would bury tracks fast." Mason gave a dry laugh. "You talk about storms like they are alive." Emily finally looked up at him. "Out here they are." Before Mason could answer, the helicopter suddenly lurched downward hard enough to throw one operator sideways against the cabin wall. Alarms screamed through the cockpit. "Downdraft," the pilot yelled. "Hold on." The Black Hawk dropped nearly 20 feet before stabilizing again. Loose equipment rattled violently across the floor while sand poured through the side seams in thin dusty streams. Logan planted himself against the cabin wall and looked toward the cockpit. "Can you land?" There was a pause before the pilot answered. "Maybe once." That answer hung heavily inside the aircraft. Everyone understood what it meant. If visibility worsened any further, extraction could become impossible. Emily tightened the straps on her gloves and finally stood from her seat. The operators instinctively moved aside to give her room without even realizing it. She stepped toward the side door and stared through the small reinforced window for several seconds. Logan watched her carefully. "See something?" Emily narrowed her eyes toward the storm outside. "Light reflection." Mason stepped closer. "From the convoy?" "Maybe." Emily pointed toward the darkness beyond the swirling dust. At first Logan saw nothing. Then another flash appeared for less than a second through the storm. Weak. Unsteady. But definitely there. One operator leaned toward the glass. "Could be fire." Emily shook her head. "Too controlled." Logan immediately turned toward the cockpit. "Bring us lower." The pilot hesitated. "Chief, visibility is almost gone." "Lower." The helicopter slowly descended through the storm while the operators braced themselves against the shaking aircraft. As they moved closer to the ground, shapes slowly emerged beneath the dust clouds. Jagged rock formations. Half-buried road markers. Then finally the outline of a vehicle tilted sideways against a sand dune. Visual confirmed, the co-pilot shouted. Convoy vehicle located. Relief swept briefly across the cabin before disappearing just as quickly when the rest of the scene became visible. Two military trucks sat partially buried beneath drifting sand nearly 100 yards apart. One vehicle leaned sharply against a ridge while another appeared almost completely swallowed by the storm. Emergency lights blinked weakly through the dust before vanishing again. Logan stared at the scene grimly. How long have they been out there? Emily answered quietly. Too long. The pilot circled once overhead while searching for a landing zone. The helicopter shook harder now as the storm intensified around them. Static exploded through the radio again. Then came a faint voice buried beneath the interference. Please, anybody, we cannot. The transmission vanished completely. One of the younger operators swallowed hard. That sounded bad. Logan looked toward the side door. We go in fast. Secure survivors and get out before the storm closes completely. Mason nodded and checked his rifle one final time. Simple enough. Emily looked at him calmly. Nothing about this storm is simple. Mason exhaled sharply but did not argue this time. Another violent gust slammed into the aircraft. The pilot cursed loudly. I need this team on the ground now. I cannot hold position much longer. Red warning lights flashed again overhead as the rear ramp slowly lowered into the roaring storm outside. Instantly the cabin filled with sand and screaming wind powerful enough to sting exposed skin. Visibility beyond the ramp barely stretched 10 feet. Logan pulled his goggles down and motioned toward the team. Move. One by one the operators stepped into the storm, disappearing almost immediately into the orange darkness below. Emily moved last. Before stepping off the aircraft, she paused for 1 second and looked toward the endless wall of swirling sand surrounding them. Logan noticed the expression on her face again. Not fear. Recognition. Like someone returning to a place they had once barely escaped alive. Then Emily Carter pulled her scarf tighter across her mouth and vanished into the storm behind the SEAL team while the Black Hawk hovered uncertainly above them like the last visible connection to the world they had just left behind. The moment Chief Logan Reeves stepped off the rear ramp, the storm swallowed him whole. Sand blasted across his goggles so hard he could barely see the operators moving only a few feet ahead. The Black Hawk hovered above them for several seconds like a shadow trapped inside the orange sky before finally pulling away into the darkness with a low fading roar. Then even that sound disappeared beneath the screaming wind. Logan lifted one arm against the storm and motioned the team forward. Stay tight, he shouted, though the wind nearly tore the words away before anyone heard them. The operators moved slowly across the shifting desert terrain while sand sank beneath their boots with every step. Visibility changed by the second. Sometimes they could see the tilted convoy vehicle ahead through the storm. Other times the entire world vanished into spinning orange dust. Mason Cole wiped sand from his goggles and muttered, I cannot see a damn thing. Emily Carter moved near the rear of the formation with her rescue pack secured tightly across her shoulders. Unlike the others, she did not keep looking around in frustration. She kept her eyes low, studying the ground, the wind direction, and the shape of the dunes forming around the stranded convoy. Logan noticed it immediately. While everyone else fought the storm, Emily seemed to move with it. They reached the first convoy truck after several exhausting minutes pushing through knee-deep sand. The vehicle leaned sharply to one side with half the tires buried beneath drifts already climbing the doors. Emergency lights blinked weakly through layers of dust coating the windshield. Logan grabbed the side handle and forced the passenger door open against the wind. Inside sat a young army driver wrapped in a thermal blanket with wide terrified eyes. Thank God, the driver gasped through a dry throat. We thought nobody was coming. Emily climbed into the cab beside him immediately and checked his pulse with calm efficient movements. How many survivors? She asked. 6 total, the driver answered. 2 in the second truck. 1 trapped near the ridge. Logan turned sharply. What ridge? The driver pointed weakly into the storm. Vehicle slid during the first wind burst. We lost visual after that. Mason cursed under his breath. This keeps getting better. Emily looked toward Logan. We need to move now. Wind speed is increasing. Logan nodded once. Cole, take 2 operators and secure the second vehicle. Mason motioned toward the team and disappeared into the storm with 2 others behind him. Logan stayed near the first truck while Emily checked the remaining survivors inside. Despite the freezing wind and constant sand blasting through the open doors, her hands never shook. She wrapped blankets around shoulders, checked breathing, secured oxygen masks, and reassured terrified soldiers with short calm instructions that somehow cut through the panic better than shouting ever could. One young communications officer stared at her through frightened eyes. Are we getting out of here? Emily adjusted the blanket around him carefully. Yes. The officer swallowed hard. How do you know? Emily looked toward the storm outside. Because we are still moving. Before the man could answer, a loud cracking sound echoed through the desert. Logan spun toward the ridge just in time to see part of the sand-covered slope collapse beneath the force of the storm. One of the operators shouted through the radio. Chief! We found the second truck. Static swallowed the rest of the transmission. Then came another voice filled with panic. We are missing Mason. Logan immediately grabbed his radio. Cole, respond. Nothing answered except heavy static and screaming wind. One operator stumbled out of the storm toward the first truck. Sand covered nearly every inch of his uniform. Chief, visibility dropped and we got separated. Mason went toward the ridge. Logan swore quietly and turned toward the orange darkness. How far? Maybe 50 yards. Emily was already securing her medical bag again. Logan looked at her sharply. Stay here with the survivors. Emily shook her head once. If he fell near the ridge, the sand drift will cover him fast. Logan hesitated for half a second before nodding. Fine. Move. The storm struck even harder as they pushed toward the ridge line. Wind screamed across the desert with enough force to stagger fully grown men sideways. Logan could barely keep visual contact with the operator beside him. Every few seconds the world vanished completely behind swirling sand clouds before partially clearing again. Cole! Logan shouted into the storm. No answer came back. Emily stopped suddenly near the base of the ridge and crouched low against the sand. Logan turned toward her. What is it? Emily brushed away drifting sand with one gloved hand. A single boot print remained barely visible beneath the surface before disappearing again. Logan stared at it. You tracked that? Emily did not answer. She looked farther up the ridge where the wind screamed loudest. Then she moved immediately toward it. Logan followed close behind while the storm intensified around them. Sand hammered their helmets and buried their boots almost as quickly as they lifted them. Then through the swirling darkness Logan finally saw a shape partially collapsed beside a rock formation. Mason Cole. Half buried already beneath drifting sand. Logan rushed forward while Emily dropped beside him instantly. Mason coughed hard as they pulled him upright. Lost my footing, he rasped through the scarf covering his mouth. Could not see anything. Emily checked his breathing quickly before tightening the strap on his oxygen mask. You inhaled too much sand. Slow your breathing. Mason stared at her through exhausted eyes. You found me. Emily looked back toward the storm. The ridge funnels the wind. Anyone disoriented would drift this direction. Mason looked confused for a second. How did you know that? Emily paused briefly before answering. Because storms repeat patterns. Another massive gust slammed across the ridge hard enough to force everyone lower against the ground. Logan grabbed Mason beneath one arm. We move now. But Emily did not stand immediately. She looked farther into the storm beyond the ridge with sudden sharp focus. Logan noticed her expression change instantly. The calm disappeared for the first time since arriving in Iraq. Emily narrowed her eyes toward the darkness like she had heard something nobody else could hear. Then quietly, almost to herself, she said 4 words that made Logan's stomach tighten immediately. There is another survivor out there. The storm howled across the ridge with such force that even breathing became difficult. Sand filled the air in thick spinning waves, scraping against goggles, uniforms, and exposed skin until every movement felt slower. Chief Logan Reeves tightened his grip beneath Mason Cole's arm while trying to keep his footing on the unstable slope. Lieutenant, he shouted over the wind, what did you hear? Emily Carter stood perfectly still for one brief moment despite the storm raging around her. Her eyes remained fixed somewhere deeper inside the orange darkness beyond the ridge. Then the sound came again. Faint. Weak. Almost impossible to hear beneath the screaming wind. A voice. Logan heard it this time too. Somebody calling for help. Mason looked up immediately through exhausted eyes. That came from the east side. Emily shook her head. No. The wind is carrying it. She pointed farther north toward a line of rock formations barely visible through the storm. The sound is bouncing off the ridge. Logan stared at her for half a second. You can tell that from this? Emily had already started moving. Stay close. The team followed her down the slope while the storm intensified even further. Visibility dropped so badly that Logan could only see Emily's outline a few feet ahead through the swirling dust. Yet somehow she never hesitated. Never stopped to search for direction. She moved steadily across the shifting terrain like she already knew where the survivor would be. Mason coughed hard beside Logan while struggling through the deep sand. How does she even see in this? Logan did not answer because he was asking himself the same question. Another weak cry echoed through the storm. Closer now. Emily immediately changed direction toward a partially collapsed communications truck buried against the base of the rocks. Half the vehicle had already disappeared beneath layers of drifting sand. One shattered emergency light blinked weakly against the darkness. Over here. Emily shouted. Logan and the operators rushed forward while the wind slammed against them hard enough to nearly knock one man off balance. Emily dropped to one knee beside the buried vehicle and brushed sand away from the driver's side door with both gloved hands. There is someone inside. Logan grabbed the handle and pulled hard against the packed sand. The door barely moved. Mason joined him despite his exhaustion, and together they forced it open just enough to squeeze inside. A young female communications specialist sat trapped beneath part of the collapsed dashboard, wrapped tightly in a survival blanket with sand coating nearly every inch of her face. Her lips trembled from cold and dehydration as she looked up toward the rescuers with unfocused eyes. Please, she whispered weakly. I thought everyone left. Emily climbed into the truck immediately beside her. Nobody left you. The woman stared at Emily for a second through the dim emergency light. You came back into this storm. Emily carefully checked her breathing while securing an oxygen mask over her face. Yes. Logan studied the crushed dashboard trapping the survivor's legs. Can you move her? Emily examined the twisted metal quickly before nodding once. If we lift together. Logan signaled the operators. The team braced themselves inside the unstable vehicle while the storm screamed outside around them. Sand poured through every opening in the truck, slowly burying the floor beneath their boots. Ready, Logan said. Emily positioned herself beside the trapped woman and nodded. Lift now. The operator strained against the bent dashboard while Logan pulled upward with both hands. After several exhausting seconds, the metal shifted just enough for Emily to guide the survivor free. The woman cried softly from fear and exhaustion as Emily wrapped another thermal blanket around her shoulders. You are okay, Emily said calmly. Keep breathing slowly. Mason looked toward the windshield where the storm outside had become nearly solid orange. Chief, we need extraction now. Logan grabbed his radio immediately. Falcon 1, this is ground team. Survivors secured. Request immediate pickup coordinates. Static exploded through the headset. Then silence. Logan tried again. Nothing. One operator checked his own communications unit and cursed quietly. Everything is dead. Another gust slammed into the truck hard enough to shake the entire vehicle sideways. The young communications specialist looked toward Emily with fear returning to her eyes. Are we trapped? Nobody answered immediately. Logan looked toward the storm outside while trying unsuccessfully to reconnect the radio. Every second the visibility worsened. Sand drifted higher around the vehicle. Even the ridge behind them had almost disappeared now. Mason leaned against the truck wall breathing heavily through his oxygen mask. We cannot stay here. Emily looked toward the roof of the buried vehicle where sand hammered constantly overhead. Then she quietly reached into her pack and pulled out the folded paper map again. Logan watched her unfold it across the dashboard despite the shaking truck and poor light. What are you thinking? Emily traced one gloved finger across the map before pointing northeast. There is an abandoned fuel checkpoint 2 miles from here. Mason stared at her. You want us to walk through this? We do not have a choice, Emily answered. Logan frowned. How do you know the checkpoint still exists? Emily paused briefly before answering. Because I sheltered there once. The truck suddenly went silent except for the storm outside. Logan slowly turned toward her. What do you mean once? Emily folded the map carefully and looked toward the swirling darkness outside the cracked windshield. 5 years ago, she said quietly, my team got caught in a storm almost exactly like this. Another violent gust slammed against the vehicle. The emergency light flickered once overhead before fading weaker than before. Mason stared at Emily through the dim orange glow. What happened to your team? Emily secured the blanket tighter around the rescued communications specialist before answering. We were not all rescued. For several seconds nobody inside the buried communications truck spoke. The storm hammered against the metal walls with a constant roar that sounded almost alive, while weak emergency lights flickered overhead through layers of drifting sand. Chief Logan Reeves stared at Emily Carter across the cramped interior, trying to process what she had just said. Your team did not make it out. Emily secured the oxygen mask tighter around the rescued communications specialist before answering. Most of them did not. Her voice remained calm, but something about the silence afterward felt heavier than the storm outside. Mason Cole sat against the wall breathing through his mask while watching her carefully now. The skepticism from earlier was gone from his face. In its place sat something closer to confusion. You survived this before. Emily finally looked toward him. Barely. Another violent gust slammed against the truck hard enough to shake sand loose from the ceiling seams. One operator checked the buried tires through the side window and cursed softly. Chief, we are losing this vehicle. Sand is piling too fast. Logan nodded immediately. Then we move. He turned toward Emily. This checkpoint you mentioned. How far exactly? 2 miles northeast. Mason looked toward the storm outside with disbelief. Nobody is walking 2 miles through this. Emily unfolded the paper map again across her knee. The storm rotates around the ridge. If we stay low along the eastern side, the wind pressure drops. Logan studied her for a second. And you know this because? Emily traced a line across the map slowly. Because 5 years ago my team made the mistake of moving west. Nobody answered after that. The operators exchanged uneasy looks while the storm screamed louder outside. Logan finally stood and adjusted his gear. All right. We move in pairs. Nobody breaks formation. Emily shook her head immediately. No, Logan frowned. Excuse me. Emily folded the map carefully and looked directly at him. The storm is too unstable. If anyone separates even 20 feet, visibility will erase them. Mason crossed his arms. So what is your plan, Lieutenant? Emily pulled a small climbing rope from her rescue pack and dropped it onto the floor between them. We stay connected. The operators stared at the rope in silence. One of them finally muttered, "You are serious." Emily nodded once. Storm survival is not combat movement. You adapt or you disappear. Logan watched her carefully again. Every instruction came immediately. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Like she had rehearsed this exact situation 100 times before. Outside, the wind screamed louder than ever against the buried truck. The emergency lights dimmed another level. Logan made his decision. Do it. Emily immediately secured the rope around her waist before passing sections to the others. Her hands moved quickly and efficiently despite the freezing cold and constant shaking vehicle. Keep 10 feet between each person, she instructed calmly. If visibility collapses completely, nobody stops moving unless I say so. Mason secured his section reluctantly but said nothing this time. The rescued communications specialist looked toward Emily nervously while clutching the thermal blanket around her shoulders. What if we cannot see anything? Emily adjusted the woman's oxygen mask gently. Then listen instead. Logan opened the truck door and instantly the storm exploded into the vehicle with violent force. Sand blasted across every surface while freezing wind howled through the opening hard enough to stagger the operators backward. Emily stepped into the storm first. The rope tightened behind her as the others followed one by one into the swirling darkness. Within seconds the buried truck vanished behind them completely. The desert no longer looked real. It looked endless. Orange dust swallowed the sky, the ground, and every distant shape until the world became nothing but movement and noise. Logan could barely see Emily leading the line ahead through the storm. Yet somehow she never slowed down. She kept one hand low near the shifting sand while scanning the terrain through narrowed eyes. Mason stumbled behind Logan while fighting the wind. How does she know where we are going? Logan tightened his grip on the rope. I do not think she is guessing. The storm pushed against them relentlessly as they moved along the base of the ridge. Sand drifted around their boots almost immediately after each step. Several times visibility collapsed completely, reducing the world to pure orange darkness where even the person directly ahead disappeared from sight. During those moments the only thing keeping the team together was the tension on the rope and Emily's calm voice somewhere ahead. Keep moving. Stay low. Watch your footing. Simple instructions. Short. Precise. Never panicked. After nearly 20 exhausting minutes, one of the operators suddenly slipped sideways into a hidden depression beneath the sand. The rope snapped tight instantly. Logan dropped to one knee to brace himself while another operator reached down to pull the man free. Easy, Emily called from ahead without turning around. The dunes shift near buried structures. Mason coughed through his mask and looked toward her silhouette in disbelief. How the hell do you know all this? Emily finally slowed near a cluster of half-buried rocks and looked back toward them through the storm. Because I learned what happens when you do not. The wind screamed louder between the rocks while sand spiraled around them in violent circles. Then Logan noticed something strange. The pressure against his body suddenly eased slightly. Not much. But enough to feel different. Emily pointed ahead through the darkness. We are close. One operator squinted into the storm. Close to what? Then lightning flashed somewhere deep inside the clouds overhead for half a second, illuminating a dark shape buried beneath layers of sand and debris roughly 100 yards ahead. A checkpoint structure. Half collapsed. Nearly swallowed by the desert. Mason stared at it through the swirling dust. You actually found it. Emily looked toward the buried checkpoint with an expression Logan could not fully understand. Not relief. Not surprise. Recognition again. Like she had already stood in this exact place years earlier. Then quietly, almost too soft for the others to hear beneath the storm, she said, "It still looks the same." The checkpoint looked like a ghost buried beneath the desert. Half the roof had collapsed inward under years of wind and drifting sand, while broken concrete barriers barely remained visible through the storm. Emily Carter moved toward the structure without hesitation, pulling the rope line behind her as the SEAL team struggled through the final stretch of open ground. Sand blasted across their bodies hard enough to force everyone lower with each step. Chief Logan Reeves could barely see the checkpoint entrance through the swirling darkness ahead. "Move faster," he shouted over the storm. Another violent gust slammed across the ridge, nearly ripping the rope from Mason Cole's hands. The rescued communications specialist stumbled sideways from exhaustion before Emily immediately caught her by the arm and steadied her without breaking stride. "Keep breathing," Emily said calmly. "We are almost there." Logan watched the woman nod weakly beneath her oxygen mask while Emily guided her forward through the storm like she had done it countless times before. The operators finally reached the checkpoint wall and pressed themselves against the cracked concrete as the wind screamed overhead. Emily found the partially buried entrance beneath layers of sand and debris. "Help me clear this." The SEALs immediately began digging with gloved hands and small tools while the storm pushed fresh sand against them almost as quickly as they removed it. Mason looked toward Emily between exhausted breaths. "You really sheltered here before?" Emily kept working without looking up. 3 days. Logan paused briefly. 3 days inside this place. Emily nodded once. Storm buried most of the exits. Nobody spoke after that. The checkpoint entrance finally opened enough for the team to squeeze inside one by one. The difference was immediate. The wind outside still roared like an angry ocean, but inside the ruined structure the pressure eased enough for everyone to breathe normally again. Flashlights illuminated cracked concrete walls, rusted storage shelves, and layers of sand covering the floor almost ankle deep. One of the operators exhaled heavily. "Feels like another planet in here." Emily immediately moved through the checkpoint interior with surprising familiarity. She stepped around collapsed debris without hesitation and stopped near the far wall where an old emergency generator sat half buried beneath dust and sand. Logan noticed it instantly. "You knew that was there." Emily brushed sand away from the control panel. "I remember the layout." Mason stared at her quietly now. There was no sarcasm left in his expression anymore. Only curiosity. "Your team survived in this checkpoint?" Emily looked down at the generator for a second before answering. "Some of us did." She pulled a small emergency battery pack from her rescue kit and connected it to the damaged controls. A few seconds later weak overhead lights flickered to life across part of the structure. The rescued survivors inside the checkpoint visibly relaxed for the first time since leaving the convoy. Logan watched Emily carefully while the others secured the room. Every movement she made carried the confidence of somebody returning to a place burned into memory. One operator approached Logan quietly. "Chief," he whispered, "who exactly is this woman?" Logan looked toward Emily across the room. "I am starting to wonder the same thing." Emily meanwhile checked each survivor again one by one. She adjusted blankets, monitored breathing, distributed water carefully, and reassured the communications specialist whose hands still shook from exhaustion. The young woman looked toward Emily through tired eyes. "Why did you come back into the storm for us?" Emily paused briefly before answering. Because someone once came back for me. Mason sat near the wall removing sand from his goggles while watching her in silence. Finally he spoke quietly. Back at the hangar, we were wrong about you. Emily continued checking supplies without looking at him. Focus on staying alive. Mason lowered his eyes slightly after that. Outside, the storm intensified again. Wind screamed through cracks in the damaged walls while sand rattled constantly across the roof overhead. Logan checked his dead radio once more with growing frustration. Still nothing. One operator looked toward the ceiling nervously. How long can this place hold? Emily finally stood near the center of the checkpoint and listened carefully to the storm outside. Then she looked toward the eastern wall. Long enough if the support beams stay buried. Logan frowned. What happens if they do not? Before Emily could answer, a loud cracking sound echoed somewhere above them. Dust rained from the ceiling instantly. Several survivors flinched while the operators reached instinctively for their gear. Emily moved immediately toward the eastern corridor with a flashlight in hand. Logan followed close behind. The narrow hallway ended near a partially collapsed storage room where sand had forced one section of the wall inward several inches. Wind howled violently through the growing crack. Emily studied it carefully. Pressure shift, she said quietly. Logan looked uneasy. Can we reinforce it? Emily shook her head once. Not enough material. Another crack echoed overhead. This one louder. Logan stared at the unstable wall. How much time do we have? Emily remained silent for several seconds while studying the movement of the drifting sand near the floor. Then finally she answered. Maybe an hour. Logan exhaled slowly. That is not enough. Emily looked toward the storm outside through the cracked wall where endless orange darkness still churned violently beyond the checkpoint. No, she said quietly. It is not. Then suddenly a faint burst of static crackled through the checkpoint radio sitting on a dusty communications desk behind them. Logan spun instantly toward the sound. The radio hissed again before a broken voice barely pushed through the interference. Ground team, this is Falcon 1, every operator inside the checkpoint froze. Logan rushed toward the radio while static continued exploding through the speakers. Falcon 1, this is Chief Reeves. Readable weak. Repeat your status. The answer came broken and distorted beneath heavy interference. Storm, worsening, extraction impossible until visibility improves, the transmission cut out briefly before returning one final time. You are on your own for now. Then the radio went silent again. The silence after the radio transmission felt heavier than the storm itself. Inside the buried checkpoint, nobody moved for several long seconds while the wind screamed outside through cracked concrete walls and shifting sand. Chief Logan Reeves stood beside the communications desk staring at the dead radio with clenched jaw muscles. One of the younger operators finally broke the silence. They are not coming back for us. Logan grabbed the radio again and tried another transmission. Nothing answered except static. He lowered the microphone slowly. Visibility is too unstable. Mason Cole leaned back against the wall, exhausted beneath layers of sand and dust. So we wait here until the storm passes. Emily Carter stood near the eastern corridor listening carefully to the sound of the wind moving through the damaged structure. This storm is still building, she said quietly. The checkpoint will not survive another full pressure shift. Another deep cracking sound echoed overhead almost as if the building itself had answered her. Dust drifted from the ceiling beams immediately. The rescued communications specialist looked toward Emily with growing fear. Then what do we do? Emily walked calmly back toward the center of the room and unfolded the paper map across an old supply crate. Logan stepped beside her while the others gathered around beneath the flickering lights. Emily pointed toward a narrow canyon roughly a mile northeast of the checkpoint. There is an emergency extraction route here. Logan frowned. The map says that road was abandoned years ago. It was. Emily traced the canyon entrance carefully. But the rock walls reduce wind exposure enough for low-altitude flight. Mason stared at her. You memorized all this? Emily looked at the map for a moment before answering. I had time. Logan studied her face closely now. 5 years ago, your team used this route. Emily nodded once. We tried to. Nobody missed the way she said it. Tried. One operator folded his arms uneasily. Lieutenant, what exactly happened out here? The storm hammered harder against the checkpoint walls while Emily remained silent for several seconds. Then finally she looked toward the swirling darkness outside the cracked windows. Our helicopter went down during a rescue operation north of Fallujah, she said quietly. Storm hit faster than forecasted. Communications failed. Navigation failed. We lost visibility within minutes. The room stayed completely silent except for the wind outside. Emily continued calmly, almost like she had repeated the story too many times in her head already. We reached this checkpoint with 9 people. Mason slowly lowered his eyes. How many walked out? Emily's answer came soft and direct. 3. Nobody spoke after that. Even the storm somehow felt quieter for one brief second. Logan stared at Emily differently now. Not as an attached rescue lieutenant. Not as the quiet woman the team had mocked back at the hangar. He looked at her like someone finally beginning to understand why she moved through the desert the way she did. Why every instruction sounded practiced. Why every glance toward the storm carried recognition instead of fear. One operator near the back of the room shook his head slowly. You survived this place for 3 days? Emily nodded once. Long enough to learn what kills people out here. Another loud crack thundered through the eastern wall. This time part of the ceiling shifted visibly overhead. Sand spilled into the room in a steady stream. Logan looked toward the damaged structure immediately. We are out of time. Emily folded the map carefully and looked around at the exhausted survivors and operators. The canyon is our only chance. Mason stared toward the storm outside with disbelief. A mile through that? Emily tightened the straps on her gloves. The wind weakens near the canyon walls. Logan crossed his arms. And if it does not? Emily met his eyes calmly. Then we keep moving anyway. Nobody argued with her this time. Not a single person. The team immediately began preparing gear while Emily distributed emergency goggles, thermal wraps, and oxygen masks to the survivors. Her movement stayed calm despite the building slowly collapsing around them. The communications specialist adjusted her blanket tighter around her shoulders while watching Emily carefully. How did you survive before? Emily paused briefly while checking the oxygen levels on a portable tank. Somebody kept us moving. Mason looked toward her quietly. And now that somebody is you. Emily did not answer. Another violent gust slammed against the checkpoint hard enough to shake loose part of the eastern ceiling. Concrete chunks crashed into the sand-covered floor while survivors flinched backward in fear. Logan immediately grabbed his gear. Everybody up. Move now. The operators secured the rope line again while Emily checked each survivor one final time. The storm outside roared louder than ever through the cracked entrance like the desert itself was waiting for them. Logan stepped beside Emily near the doorway while the others prepared behind them. Lieutenant, he said quietly, back at the hangar, my team underestimated you. Emily pulled her scarf higher against the incoming sand. Most people do. Logan studied her for a second before nodding once. Not anymore. Emily looked toward the storm without responding. Then she stepped outside first into the screaming orange darkness while the rope tightened behind her once again. The checkpoint vanished almost immediately behind them as the team pushed northeast through the violent winds. Sand blasted across their bodies so hard it felt almost solid. Visibility collapsed again within seconds. But this time nobody questioned Emily's directions. Nobody laughed. Nobody doubted her. Every operator followed the small rescue lieutenant through the storm without hesitation now, because somewhere between the buried convoy, the collapsing ridge, and the endless desert darkness, they had realized something terrifying. Emily Carter was not surviving this storm by luck. She had survived it before. The canyon entrance appeared through the storm like the shadow of a doorway cut into the desert itself. Jagged rock walls rose on both sides, barely visible beneath the swirling orange darkness, but the moment the team crossed inside the narrow passage, the pressure of the wind weakened slightly. Not enough to feel safe. Just enough to breathe without fighting every second. Chief Logan Reeves tightened his grip on the rope line while helping the exhausted communications specialist across uneven rocks buried beneath drifting sand. Behind them, the storm still screamed across the open desert like an endless engine, but inside the canyon the sound changed into a low violent echo bouncing between the stone walls. Emily Carter moved at the front of the formation with steady controlled steps despite hours of exhaustion. Sand coated every inch of her uniform. Her gloves were torn at the fingertips from digging survivors out of buried vehicles and clearing checkpoint debris, yet she never slowed down. Mason Cole looked toward her through scratched goggles while catching his breath. How much farther? Emily checked the canyon walls briefly before answering. Half a mile. One operator behind them muttered weakly, feels like 50. Nobody laughed. The team continued deeper into the canyon while the storm raged overhead beyond the narrow opening above. Several survivors stumbled repeatedly from exhaustion, but each time Emily immediately steadied them before they could fall behind. Logan noticed something else too. Every few minutes she looked upward toward the canyon walls and adjusted their direction slightly as if reading the wind itself. "What are you watching?" Logan asked quietly while moving beside her. Emily pointed toward thin streams of sand spilling over the rocks above them. "Pressure pockets." Logan frowned. "Meaning?" "The storm shifts harder where the canyon narrows." Mason overheard the exchange and shook his head in disbelief. "You really learned all this from surviving one storm?" Emily remained silent for several seconds before finally answering. "You learn fast when people depend on you." The canyon suddenly narrowed ahead into a steep passage barely wide enough for two people at a time. Wind roared violently through the gap like air forced through a tunnel. Emily immediately raised one hand. "Stop." The entire line froze. Logan looked ahead toward the narrow opening. "Problem?" Emily studied the shifting sand near the rocks carefully. Then she crouched low and pressed one gloved hand against the canyon wall. Mason stared at her. "What are you doing?" Emily did not answer immediately. Then finally she looked back toward the team. "Rockslide pressure." One operator swallowed hard. "That sounds bad." Before anyone could move, a deep rumbling echoed somewhere above them. Small stones bounced down the canyon walls into the sand below. The rescued communications specialist looked upward with panic in her eyes. "What was that?" Emily stood immediately. "Move now. Fast." The team rushed through the narrow canyon section while the rumbling above grew louder. Sand poured from cracks in the rocks overhead as the storm hammered against the canyon entrance behind them. Logan helped guide the survivors through the passage while Emily remained near the rear watching the unstable cliffside carefully. Then suddenly a massive gust exploded through the canyon behind them with enough force to throw sand into the air like a wave. The rumbling overhead intensified instantly. "Go!" Emily shouted. The operators pushed the survivors forward while rocks crashed somewhere behind them into the canyon floor. Mason stumbled sideways beneath the pressure of the wind before Logan grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. The team finally burst out of the narrow passage into a wider section of the canyon just as part of the cliffside collapsed behind them with a deafening roar. Dust and sand exploded through the air while the survivors dropped instinctively toward the ground. For several seconds nobody could hear anything except the storm and falling debris echoing through the canyon. Then silence slowly returned. Mason looked back toward the blocked passage with wide eyes beneath layers of dust. That almost buried us alive. Emily steadied herself against the canyon wall while catching her breath for the first time all night. Logan noticed the exhaustion finally showing in her face now. Pale skin beneath the sand. Trembling hands hidden beneath torn gloves. Yet even exhausted, she immediately checked the survivors before herself. The communications specialist stared at Emily in disbelief. You knew that collapse was coming. Emily adjusted the woman's blanket gently. The storm sounded different against the rocks. Mason shook his head slowly. I used to think people exaggerated survival instincts. Emily looked toward the canyon exit ahead where faint blinking lights barely appeared through the storm in the distance. Sometimes survival is just paying attention. Logan followed her gaze and immediately saw it too. Aircraft lights. Faint but real. Falcon 1, he said quietly. One operator grabbed the radio instantly and turned it on. Static burst through the speaker before a pilot's voice finally pushed through clearly for the first time in hours. Ground team, this is Falcon 1. We have visual on your emergency beacon. Relief swept through the canyon instantly. Several survivors closed their eyes in exhaustion while operators lowered their heads with visible relief. Logan grabbed the radio. Falcon 1, we have survivors secured and moving toward extraction. The pilot answered immediately. Understood. Hold your position near the canyon opening. We are inbound now. Logan lowered the radio slowly while looking toward Emily. You got us out. Emily stared toward the distant helicopter lights without answering. Mason stepped closer quietly. Lieutenant. Emily finally looked at him. Mason removed one of his gloves and extended his hand toward her. Back at the hangar. I laughed at you. Emily said nothing. Mason swallowed once before continuing. I was wrong. The storm still screamed beyond the canyon walls while the helicopter lights slowly grew brighter overhead. Emily looked at Mason's outstretched hand for one brief second before finally shaking it. Her grip was small beneath the torn gloves and sand-covered sleeves, but steady. Mason lowered his eyes slightly. You saved every one of us tonight.